Well, old political aides and public affairs people and writers have been glued to the television today because of the inauguration of President Joe Biden. Dale Edward Johnson, on the other side of the screen, was a full-time speechwriter for 7 years, writing at least one speech a week for a CEO. And you can see the cars in the background. That's a little allusion to the fact that he's also an automotive journalist and has published 1,200 items. So, who better to review the presidential inauguration than someone who has written so much? Dale, welcome back.
Good to be back again, Alan.
Well, as they say in live broadcasting, over to you, Dale. What did you think of President Biden's inaugural address?
This was very, very good. He did so many things properly on so many levels. So let's go through some of them. But first of all, I think we talk generally about what feeling is the audience left with. And I think they're, a feeling of optimism and unity. And we talked about how unity would probably be his main message. And he spoke on that several times. Before we get into the specific of the speech, though, some of the general things that he did right. First of all, with all his experience in public office, he knows a lot of those fundamentals of when to speed up his voice and when to slow down. He also knows when to increase the pitch or lower it. He knows how to use pauses, and that's not easy to do, but practice. I wonder how many times he went over this, but you can bet it was plenty of times till he got it just right.
Well,
so
let's even give him a little more credit than that, because later we may be critical. But a senator doesn't usually make a good speaker because they stand up and intone their remarks to a neutral chair. It's not a give and take like there is in the Canadian system. So he must have, practiced a lot, as you say, but also developed that skill on the campaign trail.
I think that's where he would have got it. He's been so, being in so long in Congress that he's got that experience at the constituency level and also his other campaigns for president in previous years. That can be a really good training ground for this sort of thing, but it all seemed to pay off in this speech today. I mean, these are all the things you would mark for someone doing a speech, and he did all of them correctly, sort of those physical things of giving a speech and using the power of your voice, which is so important when giving a speech. It's not just reading out loud. You got no sense he was reading. He was just talking with emotion throughout it all.
Well, and you didn't sense that he was playing to the cameras either, because he wasn't sweeping the crowd, and there wasn't much of a crowd, of course, but that windshield wiper effect is always a bit of a problem. He was looking right in the lens of the camera. He knew how to play it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think experience has to be the answer for that.
All right. I interrupted you. You were going to provide some more compliments.
Oh, yes. We also, one of the important things in his speech, we talked about how it's different than the written word. If you transcribed the speech and emailed it to someone, it would not be nearly as effective or powerful as hearing it. And one of the tools you can use in a speech is alliteration. Really doesn't make much sense in the printed word, but he used it quite a bit. And it's because alliteration it catches the ear because it sounds different than normal conversation. He talked about history and hope, for example. He used alliterations quite a few times. He talked about how to open our souls instead of hardening our hearts. So he used alliteration very effectively.
Now, you also pointed out when we spoke the other day before the address, you predicted using, wasn't it Herbert Hoover's inaugural address? You predicted that Joe Biden would speak about the pandemic, and you were exactly right. And I guess you can't ignore that. You have to deal with the negatives, don't you?
Absolutely. And on the issues, he talked about COVID as the main one, but he also talked about domestic terrorism and white supremacy and how that has to be fought. He talked about the economy. So he talked about a lot of things that are on people's minds. So he addressed the elephants in the room, if you will. And nobody's saying, well, he didn't even talk about this or that. He also talked about race relations in the States. So he hit the key points that people would have wanted to hear, that are issues that they want to know what the new president will do. And of course, his overriding theme, I guess, was unity. And that came up over and over again, where he, asked people, please join me in this battle. And we accomplish more when we're unified. He looked at history, and he also used stories. And we also talked about how that's so important in speeches. Stories can be very short. They can be 1 or 2 sentences, but they help to drive home the point. And again, more important in speeches than the written word.
Well, and they're memorable, and I'm assuming that you're referring to the little story about his father staring at the ceiling at night, not sure whether he could pay all the bills. And the reason I remember it is that stories are memorable. So there's the proof of the pudding.
Exactly. And that was just one. Instead of saying, I know a lot of you must be worried about your jobs and the economy, he related it. He's gone through this. He remembers his dad going through this. He also used a story about his mom when he was talking about, the need to understand other people. And he said, as my mom used to say, just for a moment, stand in their shoes. And again, we can almost picture him as, we don't know how old he was or what the context was, but it's easier to visualize him as a person when he tells a story like that. He also used other stories like being at the location where Abraham Lincoln was a long time ago, and more recently where women were demonstrating for the right to vote, and they were blockaded by protesters right on that very site. And he said, and today we have the first female vice president. A more powerful way than just saying, oh, we have the first female vice president, which everyone knew that months ago. But then he tells a story through history to help make that point. So stories are always effective, and they can be short.
Yeah, that did make the acknowledgement of the vice president's gender more powerful. Would have been probably too painful to point out that up until Reconstruction, there were pens in which kidnapped African Americans were kept, and auctions were held for those people. That would have been pretty painful, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Now let me challenge this probably in a somewhat painful way. This call for unity and let's all do it together and move forward, and America's coming back stronger, and all that pro forma stuff that, you can't say the opposite. You can't say, look, folks, it's all over. But it's almost like a dysfunctional family where the man and woman are in a dysfunctional marriage. The kids are at the age where they can't stand to listen to the parents and want to get out of the house. And there's, a crazy uncle in the basement. Gathering everybody together at Thanksgiving and saying, let's all, be a unified family, doesn't sound like it's going to do it. It doesn't always do it in our personal lives, doesn't often do it in our personal lives. Is this going to work politically, do you think, in such a divided country?
Well, we won't know. We'll wait and see. But certainly, I think that's the right message to send out. And there may be times, to use the analogy of the dysfunctional family, when everyone knows it's dysfunctional, there may still be a time, especially New Year's resolutions or maybe at Christmas, where the patriarch of the family could say, look, folks, let's try to get together better. Let's really give it a shot. And, there might be some people in this dysfunctional family saying, yeah, it would be nice if we didn't do so much bickering. And boy, maybe after that inspiring speech, I'd be willing to give it a shot. And now most presidents always talk about unity. So in a way, that's not completely new. But I think in light of what the US has been going through the past 4 years, this is even a more important message now. And again, he gave thanks to those people who had worked for the election. Obviously, this is paid off for them. But he also said, I also want to talk to those of you who didn't support us. And he said, please hear me out. He just wants a chance to be heard. And he said, if you disagree, so be it. You have the right to dissent peacefully. But he also said, disagreement must not lead to disunion.
Right. I agree that was a powerful moment. And would you also agree that when he said, There are numerous divisions that we have, including people who watch different news sources. So he's speaking to that kind of polarization as well, and the manufacturing and manipulating of facts, which I think was a good thing to address too.
He talked about Donald Trump without mentioning his name, and that was one example on people who watch certain media or manipulate the facts. He also gave thanks to all his predecessors of both parties who were in attendance. And of course, the elephant in the room is that Donald Trump was not there. So he did, in a way, make reference to the previous president without mentioning his name at all.
Now, Dale, in addition to being a writer, which I introduced you as, and a speechwriter specifically, you were also a broadcaster, and we were broadcasters together at a couple of different stations and cities. And if this were live coverage, and I said, Dale, don't look at your notes, but just tell me, was there a memorable phrase in this inauguration address, such as nothing to fear but fear itself, or ask not what your country can do for you, or government isn't the solution to our problems, it is the problem? Was there a phrase that is going to be quoted 10 years from now?
I don't know if there's one magical phrase, but I think there isn't one that stood out for me. But I think the message of unity and how we have to dial the temperature down and we have to understand each other better. And he said that several different ways throughout the speech. And to me, that's the main message. If someone stopped me on the street and said, I didn't see Biden's address, what did he say? I have, 5 seconds. I would say he said the country has to really unify. He really appealed to everybody to pull together to make the country better. I don't recall one phrase. I mean, there were several phrases with that message, but I don't think there's one that would match the ones you've mentioned from previous speeches.
Well, fair enough. And you were able to paraphrase it, which you would do in live coverage as well. But let me try this one on for you. He said, when he located America in the world and said the world is watching, which was another negative that he needed to address, and he did so positively, he said, let us not lead by the example of our power, but by the power of our example. Now that made me think of Theodore Sorensen's Inversions, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. It wasn't quite as eloquent, it wasn't as eloquently delivered or formally delivered as JFK, but I thought that turn of a phrase was in the same ballpark as the best.
Those inversions can be so powerful. And I think sometimes too, it may take a while for the news cycle and history books to determine what the key phrase was from this speech. Just as some of these others, I don't know if they were the headlines the next day, but I think it was over a number of years that they became the memorable lines from those speeches.
You know what I'm reminded of? I have a book somewhere on the back shelf about all the New York Times reviews of famous Broadway plays, and Streetcar Named Desire, the review goes on about what a wonderful performance Jessica Tandy made, no mention whatsoever of Marlon Brando. So sometimes it does take a while for excellence to sink in. Now, Dale,
absolutely. Yes.
Other thoughts before I babble on here?
Well, I think I'm just checking my notes because it all happened so quickly. He also repeated a lot of words. Repetition can be very beneficial. Repeating things can be a good way to do it. He said, we will get through this together. Together. And again, if that was in a written document, you'd say, well, does he have a stutter? Or why is, what is this extra word here for? But in the spoken word, it was very effective. And again, that's what we have to keep in mind, how the written word is different than speaking.
Yeah, no, you're right. It is a great punctuation mark, more powerful than an exclamation mark in print, but a very powerful thing to repeat that word.
I thought it was interesting too, how he at one point asked, part of it is getting the audience involved. And at one point he asked, let's have a moment for a silent prayer for all of the 400,000 people who have died because of COVID. So suddenly the audience is involved. They're not passively watching and listening to him talk. They're involved. And again, he, instead of just saying, let's remember those who died, he then listed off some examples: mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, sons, daughters. Well, this begins to cover everyone: friends, neighbors, relatives. But again, that way each person can think of someone they know or that they've heard of, who's, maybe your spouse or your parents did not die of this, but you may have had a friend. So when he says friend, you'll be able to more connect with what he's saying.
It's interesting you mentioned that, Dale, because even words like imagine this, or as Nixon said, one word sentence, think, things that you ask the audience to do perhaps silently can be very involving. It can become manipulative and phony. And I'm reminded of the former NDP leader Mulcair and his speech at his convention, where he said, stand up for the indigent and stand up for the poor and stand up for this, that, and the other. He seemed to be trying to manipulate the audience into giving him a standing ovation. And I've seen that trick used elsewhere, and it is just a little over the top, I think.
Well, and that's what's so difficult in public speaking and writing, for that matter. Sometimes a good idea carried too far becomes a bad idea. And I think, though, Joe Biden in this one hit everything right on. I mean, I didn't, nowhere did it strike me like, oh, no, not another silent prayer. This is the fifth one in this presentation, which would have been overdoing it. So I think his balance was very good with some of these tools.
Now, Dale, the big controversy, of course, is who's the better singer, J-Lo or Lady Gaga?
I've got to go with Lady Gaga.
I'm afraid I do too. I think when there's one note on the page, you should just kind of sing that note as opposed to 3 or 4 below and 3 or 4 above. And that miasma can lead out from miasma and melisma. Whatever it is, it's a mess sometimes. Anyway, no great offense to J-Lo. Her bank account is not hurting because of my review, but I think Lady Gaga could really belt it out.
Yes.
And good little fist bumps and her interaction with the other presidents and so on. That was great. Dale, any final thoughts on the inauguration of Joseph R. Biden?
I think in the years to come, this speech is going to go down as one of the better inauguration speeches. Some of them are very, you might say, routine and predictable. But I think this one, especially in the times that the USA is facing now, I think this was precisely on the mark. And it was not only well written, but well delivered. And they're each worth 50%, really. I mean, you can have the best written speech that's poorly delivered, and it's going to fall flat. And in a way, delivery might even be more important. You could have a poor speech, but if it's really well delivered, that might be more beneficial. So maybe it's 75% delivery and 25% content.
You've sparked some thought. I think John Diefenbaker is a great example of that. If you read his speeches, they were pretty ordinary and pedestrian. But if you heard him speak, boy, you thought he was going to open up the North and get everybody to work again and, protect human rights, much of which he did. First Indigenous senator and so on. But the written word and the spoken word, you keep emphasizing. I just thought of that example. Quite different. Absolutely. All right.
All right.
That's 30 for now, as they say in journalism. And thank you very much for your observations.
You're welcome. We'll see you later.
Dale Edward Johnson, many thanks.